year was 1990, when a teenage girl from Oregon vanished without a trace, leaving her parents shrouded in decades of unanswered questions and aching grief. For more than 22 years, they lived in quiet torment, clinging to hope and haunted by silence. But on an ordinary morning, with the Pacific mist drifting over their coastal town, a single glance at a forgotten yearbook in their daughter's room would turn a father's world upside down, forever altering the course of their family's story. The morning fog, thick and unrelenting, rolled inland from the Pacific Ocean, blanketing the sleepy coastal town of Mornington, Oregon. Like a ghostly veil, it draped over the town's winding roads, pine-covered hills, and the jagged cliffs that overlooked the relentless surf. The lighthouse on Windward Point flickered faintly in the distance, its beams slicing through the haze in sweeping arcs. Frank Sanders stood silently at the window of a room that had not changed in over 2 decades, watching the mist dance around the silhouette of that familiar beacon. It was once a scene that brought him comfort. Now, it brought a different kind of feeling, one weighed down by the gravity of memories. He turned slowly away from the view, his eyes scanning the bedroom that had remained untouched since the spring of 1990, the last season Alicia was ever seen. Her posters, slightly faded, still adorned the pale blue walls. Her desk was precisely how she had left it, textbooks neatly stacked, notebooks filled with the elegant, looping handwriting of a young woman preparing for her future. Her closet door stood ajar, revealing clothes that had not moved in 22 years. Dresses, jeans, and a collection of sweaters she loved so much. "It's time," Frank murmured, his voice almost inaudible. The words echoed the difficult decision he and his wife, Elaine, had finally made during a long conversation the night before. They had spent countless sleepless nights avoiding this moment, postponing the inevitable confrontation with a reality that no parent wants to accept. But now, after so many years, they had come to a solemn agreement. It was time to let go, not of Alicia's memory, but of the physical space that had imprisoned their grief. They would begin the painful task of sorting through her belongings. Clothes and books that could be donated would go to children in need. Some cherished items would be moved to the attic, and a few keepsakes, those most tied to Alicia's essence, would be preserved. Frank pushed the window open to let in the crisp ocean air. A gust disturbed the dust that had settled like snow on every surface, triggering a fit of sneezing. He wiped his eyes, whether from dust or tears, even he wasn't sure. He stepped to the closet and began carefully removing each article of clothing. Every item told a story. There was her soft blue sweater, worn so often it still held the faintest scent of her perfume. The elegant dress she'd worn to junior prom still carried a speck of glitter near the collar. A pair of faded jeans patched lovingly with hearts and flowers Alicia had sewn on herself drew a quiet chuckle from Frank. He worked methodically, creating 3 boxes, one for donations, one for storage, and one for personal mementos. When he reached the school supplies, he hesitated. These weren't just notebooks or binders, they were the echoes of his daughter's ambitions, dreams that had been abruptly silenced. Alicia had been accepted to the University of Oregon, where she planned to pursue a degree in marine biology. She'd always been captivated by the ocean's mysteries. As Frank sifted through a stack of binders, his hand brushed against a book he didn't immediately recognize. It was thick and heavy, bound in glossy black with golden lettering on the cover. Her high school yearbook. A wave of guilt surged in his chest. In the weeks and months after Alicia disappeared, he and Elaine had been incapable of confronting anything that might deepen the wound. They'd never opened that yearbook, too pained to see Alicia's face among her classmates, too broken to bear the contrast between her frozen smile and their unfolding lives. He sank onto the edge of her bed, the yearbook resting like a weight in his lap. It felt like he was holding a relic, a preserved slice of time. Slowly, reverently, he opened it. The pages crackled slightly with age. He turned them until he reached her senior portrait. Her smile leapt out at him, bright, full of hope and mischief. It punched the air from his lungs. 22 years, he whispered, his fingers trembling as they traced the outline of her face. I have to learn how to hold you in my heart without this pain, sweetheart. His gaze wandered to the adjacent photo. Amy Davidson, Alicia's best friend. Amy's round face and curly hair summoned a flood of memories. The girls staying up late whispering secrets, giggling over shared crushes, huddled over bowls of popcorn during movie nights. Amy had been a constant presence in their home. Until she wasn't. After Alicia vanished, Amy had visited faithfully for several months, but as time passed, the visits became less frequent until they stopped altogether. Frank had never blamed her. The loss had been too much for everyone. Driven by a sudden curiosity, he flipped to the section of individual senior bios. Each graduate had a dedicated page, complete with quotes and acknowledgments. Alicia's page was filled with gratitude and joy. Thanks to Mom and Dad for always believing in me, to my teachers who never gave up, and to my best friend, Amy. Don't forget to return my book, The Secret Garden, illustrated edition. You old grandma. Love you forever. Frank's lips curved into a soft smile at the inside joke. That playful jab was classic Alicia. He turned to Amy's page next. Her quote was more introspective, something about chasing dreams and standing up for what matters. Her biography spoke of ambition and confidence. That reference to The Secret Garden tugged at Frank's thoughts. That had been Alicia's favorite book for years. She'd amassed several versions over time, but he couldn't recall seeing the illustrated edition anywhere in the room. Had Amy ever returned it? Feeling the tug of a puzzle waiting to be solved, Frank rose and began rifling through boxes of Alicia's books. Dust coated the air, irritating his eyes and sinuses, so he carried the boxes into the living room for better light and air. There he spread the contents on the coffee table, floor, and sofa. Fantasy novels, biology texts, nature magazines. They were all there, but not The Secret Garden. On impulse, he flipped to the back of the yearbook, hoping to find something, anything. There, scribbled in bright purple ink, was Amy's phone number with a note, "Call me anytime, BFF." His hand shook slightly as he dialed. He didn't expect the number to work. Unsurprisingly, an automated voice informed him that the number was no longer in service. Just then, the front door creaked open. Elaine stepped in, balancing 2 bags from the farmer's market. She froze as she took in the disarray, books and papers strewn everywhere. "Frank, what is all this?" she asked, her voice sharp with shock and an undercurrent of something deeper, anguish. "I was just going through Alicia's things, like we talked about," he said, rising slowly. Elaine's face darkened. "We agreed to sort and store her things, not scatter them across the house. I thought we were moving forward, not falling back into the past." "I'm not falling back," Frank said gently. "I'm trying to make peace with it, all of it." "Elaine, I found her yearbook," Frank said, his voice gentle but urgent as he held the book close to his chest. "I was looking through it, and I saw something that made me wonder. Something Alicia wrote." Elaine placed the grocery bags down on the kitchen counter with a noticeable stiffness in her posture. The tension in her shoulders was unmistakable, and her movements betrayed a mix of irritation and restraint. "Frank, what could possibly be so important after all this time?" she asked, without turning to face him. He moved closer, opening the book to a marked page and holding it out for her to see. "It's this," he said, pointing to the handwritten note Alicia had left beneath her senior photo. She mentioned a book. "The Secret Garden," said Amy borrowed it and never gave it back. I was curious if it might still be here, among her things." Elaine exhaled deeply. her breath heavy with exasperation. "A book, Frank?" she asked, shaking her head. "After all these years? That doesn't matter anymore. All of Alicia's things. They're just objects now. They're gathering dust. We don't need to drag Amy into this. It's been over 2 decades. She's probably forgotten all about it, if she even still has it." Frank hesitated for a moment, then changed the subject slightly. "Do you know where Amy is now? Have you seen her lately?" Elaine turned slowly, finally meeting his eyes. "Yes. I've seen her a few times when I'm in town. She lives out of a camper now, keeps to herself. We don't talk, but I know she's still around." Frank nodded thoughtfully. "I was thinking maybe I'd visit her," he said, his voice tentative. "Not just because of the book. It's been so long since we've seen her. She was like family once." Elaine's hands paused over the groceries as she unpacked them. She turned fully to face him, her expression a complex blend of empathy and resistance. "Frank, I can't do that today," she said firmly. "I don't have anything against Amy, but I'm not ready to see her. Last night we agreed, finally, to start letting go, to clean out the room, to make peace with what happened. Going to see Amy today, that feels like we're reopening the wound." She gestured toward the scattered boxes and books in the living room. "I'll stay here, clean up, and sort everything for the attic, like we planned. But if you feel like you need to go, that's your decision." Frank absorbed her words in silence, nodding slowly. He understood. Elaine had carried this pain every day, just like him. But something had shifted in him. There was a pull he couldn't ignore. A quiet but persistent voice in his gut urging him to seek closure, even if he didn't yet understand how it might come. "All right," he said softly. "I'll go alone." Elaine gave him a long, steady look before walking to a drawer and pulling out a small notepad. She scribbled down directions to where Amy usually parked her camper. "Don't push her too hard, Frank," she warned. "She was like a sister to Alicia. Losing her must have shattered her too." Frank nodded again, his heart growing heavier with each passing minute. He gathered the yearbook, his phone, wallet, and keys. As he moved toward the door, he cast one last glance at Elaine, who had already returned to gently restacking Alicia's books. Guilt nipped at the edge of his conscience. He was leaving her alone with the burden of memory and dust. But the feeling that had stirred inside him wouldn't let go. He stepped outside, greeted once again by the familiar mist that seemed to linger eternally over Mornington. The air was cool and damp, and the yearbook felt solid against his chest as he cradled it in his arms. He climbed into his car and followed the winding coastal roads, passing through the wooded hills and quiet neighborhoods that defined the town's sleepy charm. It took him about 20 minutes to reach the place Elaine had described, a modest area on the outskirts of town where a collection of camper vans had settled like a temporary village. Some looked like they'd been there for years, with flower beds neatly arranged beside their steps and lawn chairs perched on welcome mats. Others were more transient, with mud-spattered tires and faded license plates from other states. Frank pulled into a gravel lot and stepped out, scanning the line of campers. There were a dozen or so, each with its own character. He spotted a man in his 50s washing the windows of a nearby RV and walked over. "Excuse me," Frank said. "I'm looking for Amy Davidson. Do you know which camper is hers?" The man nodded and pointed toward a blue and white camper at the far end of the row. "That's Amy's," he said. "She's quiet, keeps to herself. Nice lady." Frank offered a polite thanks and made his way over. The camper was modest but clearly cared for. A small potted plant sat by the door and a wind chime swayed gently from the awning. He paused, took a deep breath, and knocked. After a few seconds, the door creaked open. A woman appeared in the doorway, her once bright blonde hair now tinged with streaks of gray. Her face bore the faint lines of time, but her eyes, those familiar, expressive eyes, held a glimmer of something unchanged. "Can I help you?" she asked, her brow furrowing slightly. Frank realized in that moment how much time had truly passed. Neither of them would have recognized the other on the street. She had been a teenager back then, and he, a younger, more hopeful man. My, it's Frank Sanders, Alicia's father." Recognition dawned like a sunrise over her face. First confusion, then shock, followed by a cascade of emotions. Sorrow, warmth, and something else.
"Mr. Sanders,"
she whispered, stepping back.
"Oh my goodness, please, come in."
Frank climbed the 2 small steps into her camper. It was warm, clean, and cozy, decorated with photographs, houseplants, and handmade quilts. The space reflected care and comfort. "Please, have a seat," Amy said, motioning to the dining nook. "Would you like some coffee?" "Yes, thank you," Frank replied, settling in. He watched her move about the small kitchen. Her actions were precise, almost cautious, as though she was still processing his unexpected visit. "What brings you here after all these years?" she asked as she placed a steaming mug in front of him and sat down. Frank reached into his coat and withdrew the yearbook. "I found this today. We were cleaning Alicia's room. I realized I'd never actually looked through it." Amy's gaze settled on the book. Her hand reached out, touching the cover gently. "I remember this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You little one remember me," she said. "I shall always be there." Frank turned to the page with Alicia's note. "She mentioned the secret garden, said you borrowed it. I just wondered." Amy's lips curled into a wistful smile, and tears shimmered in her eyes. "I never gave it back," she admitted. "I was forgetful. Alicia used to tease me about it all the time." She stood and walked to a small cabinet tucked beneath her bed. After rummaging briefly, she returned with a well-worn copy of The Secret Garden, the illustrated classic edition, its spine creased and cover dulled by time. "I couldn't part with it," she said, her voice trembling. After she disappeared, this became the only piece of her I had left. She held the book with both hands, reverently, as though it were something sacred. "Would you mind terribly if I kept it? It's become so important to me. I've read it so many times. Each page reminds me of her." Frank looked at the book, then back at Amy, and nodded slowly. "Of course. I understand." She handed it to him. He opened it carefully, flipping through pages that had yellowed with age, some corners folded, faint notes scribbled in Alicia's handwriting. Though the book's pages were aging, the illustrations within remained vivid. Gardens in bloom, children beneath trellises, and ivy-covered stone walls stood out in rich color. As Frank turned through them slowly, something caught his attention. A page tucked partway in, acting as a makeshift bookmark. Carefully, he slid it out. It was a torn page from a glossy teen fashion magazine. Unfolding it, he was greeted by a full-color photo spread of teenage models dressed in stylish outfits from the early 90s. One boy in particular drew his attention. His posture was confident, his expression casual yet magnetic. There was something hauntingly familiar about him. "Who's this?" Frank asked, pointing to the boy in the photo and turning the page toward Amy. She leaned closer to get a good look, then nodded. "That's Jason Murray. He was in our graduating class." Frank flipped back through the yearbook, searching through the student photos until he found Jason's name and picture not far from Alicia's. "Right? I remember now. He did modeling back then, didn't he? Pretty successful for someone his age." Amy nodded again. "Yeah, he was already doing shoots when we were in school. From what I've heard, he still works in fashion. Doesn't model as much anymore, but he has his own clothing brand now." Frank studied the image for a moment longer. Then, Looking up thoughtfully, he said, "You know, Elaine once mentioned, probably in passing, that you and Jason were dating back then. I didn't really think much of it at the time." Amy's expression changed instantly. The warmth in her features faded, replaced by discomfort. "That's not true," she said firmly. "I was never involved with Jason. I didn't even like him. Honestly, I avoided him. Alicia was actually the one who spent time with him for a while." Frank blinked, caught off guard. "Alicia, she never told us anything about Jason." Amy's voice softened slightly, though her brow remained furrowed. "It was during our junior year, 11th grade. Jason seemed to have a crush on her. It wasn't serious, didn't last long. Once we figured out what kind of guy he really was, we stopped hanging around him." "What kind of guy was he?" Frank asked. "He was arrogant, self-absorbed, manipulative sometimes. Alicia and I both saw it, and she stopped talking to him completely. At least for a while." Amy paused then, her eyes narrowing as she tried to retrieve some faded memory. "But now that you mention it, I do remember seeing them talk again later on, senior year, a few times. It felt strange to me, considering we'd both agreed he was no good." "What were they talking about?" Frank asked, his interest piqued. "Alicia asked me some strange things back then," Amy replied, her tone reflective. "Questions about whether people can change, whether someone like Jason just needed help, needed someone to believe in them. She even asked if I'd drive past his house with her once. She wanted to see where he lived." Frank listened silently, a deep knot forming in his stomach. "Did the police know about this?" he asked after a moment. "Yes. I told them during the investigation," Amy confirmed. "They questioned everyone in our class, Jason included. But Alicia was dating Brandon Knox by that point, and he was their main suspect." Frank nodded slowly. "I remember Brandon. He came to our house a few times to pick her up. We were never sure about him either, but he had an alibi, right?" "Yeah," Amy said. "He was cleared. Still, the attention and pressure were too much. He left town not long after Alicia disappeared." Frank ran his hand down his face, trying to absorb the weight of everything he'd just heard. "And Jason? Did they ever find anything suspicious with him?" Amy shook her head. "Nothing serious. Alicia barely mentioned him to me during our final year. Just those few weird questions. Other than that, she seemed uninterested." Frank glanced back down at the fashion magazine page. It still puzzled him. Why had Alicia kept it? Why use a photo of someone she supposedly wanted nothing to do with as a bookmark? He voiced the question, and Amy gave a small half-smile. "That page was from her favorite magazine. I remember it clearly. I told her how much I couldn't stand Jason, and she laughed. She tore out the page with his picture, folded it, and said it was the perfect thing to shove between book pages. A joke, nothing more. Still, something about it didn't sit right with Frank." "Do you know where Jason is now?" he asked. Amy picked up her phone and opened a messaging app. "Actually, our high school alumni group had a reunion just last weekend. It was hosted at Jason's house. I didn't go, but someone shared his address in the group chat." She scrolled for a moment, then held up the screen for Frank to see. "Here it is." "Would you mind forwarding it to me?" he asked, taking out his phone. They exchanged numbers, and a moment later the message came through. Amy hesitated before speaking again. "Do you think Jason might have had something to do with Alicia's disappearance?" Frank stared at the address on his screen. "I honestly don't know, but it seems strange, doesn't it? That she had any kind of connection to him, however brief, and never told Elaine or me. When she was with Brandon, she was open about it. But this, it was hidden." He rose to his feet, holding the yearbook under one arm. "Thank you, Amy, for your time and for letting me see the book again." Amy touched his arm gently. "Please tell Elaine I said hello. And thank you for letting me keep the book. It means the world to me." Frank nodded with a soft smile and stepped out into the cool afternoon light. His thoughts raced. The image of Jason in that photo, Alicia's secret interest, and the torn magazine page, all of it churned in his head like pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed. He settled into his car, placing the yearbook on the seat beside him, and stared at the address on his phone. He knew he'd told Elaine they were done with all this, that today would be about closure, about finally letting go. But something about that address whispered to him. He picked up his phone and called Detective Ron Keller, the lead investigator from Alicia's case. The call rang, then went to voicemail. Frank left no message. He knew what he had to do. Yet despite all his efforts to quiet his mind, Frank couldn't shake what Amy had said, or the strange significance of that makeshift bookmark. Alicia's questions about Jason, her sudden curiosity about where he lived, and the suggestion that she had once hoped he might change, it all echoed in his head like a riddle begging to be solved. He stared at the road ahead, then murmured to himself, "Just a quick drive-by, just to see it." He turned the ignition. 20 minutes later, Frank found himself cruising through a part of Mornington he rarely visited, a district known for its manicured landscapes and quiet opulence. Here the homes were large, stately, and trimmed with hedges shaped to geometric perfection. Children's bikes sat by the front porches like decor, and security systems blinked quietly from well-lit entryways. It was a far cry from the modest, lived-in home where he and Elaine had raised Alicia. Eventually, he reached the address Amy had given him. Jason Murray's home stood at the center of a curved driveway, surrounded by pristine landscaping and towering trees that shaded the property like silent guardians. It was a 2-story house, expansive and modern, with tall windows and a clean white exterior. The kind of house that said its owner had succeeded, and knew it. Frank parked across the street, just out of the line of the driveway, and sat for a few moments, engine idling. He watched the front of the house, taking in every detail. The movement of the curtains, the faint sound of wind brushing through the treetops, the quietness of the block. The gate at the front was open. Then, the front door opened, and a man stepped outside. He was followed by a younger woman, perhaps in her late 20s, stylish and confident. Even from where he sat, Frank recognized Jason immediately. Older now, clearly in his early 40s, but still possessing the strong jawline, the piercing eyes, and the polished demeanor that had once made him a standout even in high school. Jason was still attractive, the kind of man who had aged well and who carried himself with the easy confidence of someone used to attention. He walked the woman to her car, exchanged a few words, then leaned in and kissed her on the cheek. She smiled, waved, and drove away. Just as Jason turned back toward the house, his gaze swept across the street and landed on Frank's car. Their eyes met. Frank cursed under his breath. His windows weren't tinted, and the late afternoon sun left him fully exposed. Jason's posture shifted. The relaxed elegance in his stance stiffened, and a guarded expression crossed his face. Knowing there was no longer any point in pretending otherwise, Frank turned off the ignition and got out of the car. He approached the open gate, slowly, hands visible, trying to look as unthreatening as possible. "Good afternoon," he called out, attempting a friendly tone. "Jason Murray, right?" Jason didn't respond with a smile. His eyes narrowed, and his jaw set tightly. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Why are you watching my house? Are you with the media? A reporter?" Frank raised both hands slightly. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to alarm you," he said calmly. "My name is Frank Sanders. I'm Alicia Sanders' father. She was in your class. She disappeared 22 years ago." Jason's face changed at once. The guarded look hardened. "What do you want?" he asked flatly. Frank tried not to show how jarring the coldness of Jason's tone was. "I heard there was a class reunion here last weekend. I'm trying to piece together some things about my daughter's past. I was told you might have known her a little, back in school." Jason folded his arms. "Who told you that? Amy Davidson?" His voice sharpened. "She didn't even come to the reunion." "I'm not trying to stir anything up," Frank said, carefully choosing his words. "It's just... we still don't know what happened to Alicia. I'm not accusing anyone. I just need to understand. Did you ever spend time with her?" Jason's face twisted with annoyance. "I was never her boyfriend. I barely knew her. I wasn't even interested in her. I told the police that back then, and I don't like being dragged into it again." Frank blinked, surprised by the hostility. "I never said you were her boyfriend. Just that you might have talked. I was told she asked you some questions, maybe even spent time around you." "If we did talk," Jason said with a dismissive wave of his hand, "it was probably because I needed homework help or something. I always returned anything I borrowed. There was never anything between us. Nothing worth remembering. I already told the police everything."
"Sure we did."
But Frank wasn't just listening to Jason's words. He was watching his body language. The man was clearly agitated. He shifted from foot to foot, glanced over his shoulder more than once, and scanned the street nervously, as if worried they were being watched. His polished demeanor had begun to fray at the edges. "I don't understand why you're here now," Jason continued, voice rising slightly. "It's been 22 years. Why come to me? I have a reputation to protect. I can't have people seeing me out here being questioned like this. Someone's going to make assumptions." "I'm not trying to make trouble," Frank said again. "I just need answers." "Well, I don't have any," Jason snapped. Without waiting for a reply, he turned sharply and strode back toward his house. "You should leave," he called over his shoulder. "I have nothing else to say about Alicia Sanders." Frank remained at the gate, stunned by the intensity of the reaction. Jason's response had been aggressive, defensive, even fearful. It was a strange way to react to simple questions about a long-past high school acquaintance, especially from someone with nothing to hide. He eventually turned and walked back to his car, his steps slower now. Once inside, he gripped the steering wheel tightly. His hands were shaking. "What was I thinking?" he muttered. "I told Elaine we'd end it today, close the book." He started the engine and looked one last time at the house. If Elaine found out he had come here instead of helping sort Alicia's things, she would be heartbroken. Worse, she'd feel betrayed. Frank had allowed himself to be pulled back into that old spiral, the endless cycle of maybes, what-ifs, and cold trails. Still, as he drove away and the expensive houses faded in his rearview mirror, the conversation with Jason replayed again and again in his mind. Jason's words had been harsh, yes, but it was the underlying panic in his tone and the darting eyes that lingered with Frank. Perhaps Jason had simply been startled. Perhaps being confronted out of nowhere on a Sunday afternoon by the father of a missing classmate had pushed him into an awkward defensive stance. But Frank had seen enough over the years to recognize when someone was simply nervous and when someone was hiding something. As he passed the welcome sign back into town, he knew one thing with certainty: Jason Murray was unsettled by his presence. And Frank Sanders. He wasn't sure anymore that Alicia's past was as simple as they had believed. Frank found his hands turning the wheel before his mind fully registered the decision. He was heading toward Mornington Memorial Funeral Home. If he and Elaine were truly ready to close this painful chapter in their lives, maybe it was time to take the next step, something formal, a memorial, a service to honor Alicia's memory, even without a body to lay to rest. It wouldn't bring closure in the way they once hoped, but perhaps it would help make peace with the absence that had stretched across 22 hollow years. The funeral home was quiet and understated, nestled between old trees with branches that arched protectively over the parking lot. Inside, the air was hushed, the lighting soft and respectful. A receptionist with a kind face greeted him at the desk, her voice low and gentle when she asked how she could help. Frank explained who he was, why he had come. Her expression shifted slightly, a flicker of recognition, perhaps sympathy. Without probing further, she handed him a selection of brochures, options for services, memorial plaques, floral arrangements, and urns for symbolic ashes or keepsakes. He thanked her politely and stepped back outside, the weight of the printed papers heavier than expected. As he reached his car and placed the brochures on the passenger's seat, movement across the street caught his attention. He squinted. Jason Murray was just emerging from a nearby hardware store, walking briskly toward the cashier's counter with a shovel in one hand and a small wooden box in the other. Frank froze, one hand still on his door handle, the other clenched at his side. His eyes locked on Jason as the man paid for the items, walked out, and loaded them into the trunk of his car. Frank instinctively ducked into the driver's seat, not wanting to be recognized, and glanced through his rearview mirror. Jason didn't linger. Moments later, he walked next door into a floral shop. Frank sat in stunned silence, heart pounding. When Jason came out again, he was carrying a bouquet of white hyacinths. White hyacinths, Alicia's favorite. A chill ran down Frank's spine. It could have been coincidence, of course. Any number of people might favor the same flowers. But paired with Jason's defensive behavior earlier, the shovel, the wooden box, the weight of it all pressed down on Frank's chest. Jason placed the bouquet carefully into the car and drove away. Frank didn't give himself time to reconsider. He started his own engine and pulled out into traffic, following at a safe distance. The streets of Mornington passed in a blur. Jason's car moved through town with ease, eventually veering onto the coastal road that led northward toward Whitlow Cliff, a rugged expanse known for its ocean views and secluded vacation cottages. Frank kept his distance, careful to stay a few cars back. After nearly 20 minutes of driving, Jason turned onto a narrow, winding private road. At the end of the lane stood a modest cottage perched near the cliff's edge, surrounded by windswept trees and tall grass. Frank didn't follow directly in. He drove past, continued up the road until he found a place to park among the brush, then doubled back on foot, crouching behind the trees for cover. From his hidden vantage point, Frank watched as Jason unlocked the door to the cottage and went inside. A few minutes later, he re-emerged, carrying a large container of water. He placed it carefully into a small garden trolley, then added the shovel, the wooden box, and the bouquet of hyacinths. Without hesitation, Jason began walking away from the cottage, down a narrow path that disappeared into the brush, heading toward the sea. Frank waited until Jason had gone far enough ahead to be safe to follow. Then, heart hammering, he crept down the slope, staying low, moving silently through the trees and shrubs that lined the narrow cliffside trail. The trail wound through dense growth, scrubby pines, wiry grasses, wildflowers tangled in the wind. After several minutes, it opened into a clearing. The overlook was stunning. Waves crashing against jagged rocks below, sea mist rising into the air like ghostly fingers. The afternoon sun cast long shadows, coloring the sky in pale orange and silver. Frank crouched behind a large boulder and watched as Jason stopped at the edge of the clearing. He looked around, scanning the landscape, then lifted the shovel and began digging. The soil was rocky, difficult to break. Jason worked with determination, though it clearly took effort. The ground didn't yield easily, suggesting it hadn't been disturbed in a long time. Once the hole reached about 2 feet deep, Jason paused, He knelt beside it, opened the wooden box, and stared at its contents. From Frank's position, he couldn't make out what was inside, but Jason's demeanor shifted. His posture softened, his expression thoughtful, almost sorrowful. Jason's lips moved in silence, as though reading something aloud or whispering to someone only he could see. He sifted through papers, letters, perhaps, or journal pages, lifting each one, scanning it slowly, then setting it down with care. Then, just as he reached for the lid to close the box, a gust of wind swept across the cliff. Papers flew up into the air, spinning like startled birds. Jason swore and snapped the lid shut, but several pages had already scattered. He scrambled, chasing them down one by one across the clearing, through the grass and toward the cliff's edge. Once the last sheet had been recovered, Jason returned to the hole. He placed the wooden box gently inside, then took the bouquet of hyacinths and laid them reverently on top. Using the shovel, he filled in the hole layer by layer, patting the dirt down firmly. When he finished, he poured water over the mound, pressing it down until the ground looked undisturbed. He stood there for a long time, gazing down at the unmarked grave. His lips moved again, but this time his voice rose just enough for the wind to carry it to Frank's ears. "Think you can hold these memories now, Alicia?" Frank recoiled as if struck. The name had landed like a thunderclap. He stumbled backward, foot catching on a loose stone. Pebbles skittered down the slope, and he reached out, catching himself against a tree trunk. He clamped his mouth shut to prevent a gasp from escaping. His heart thundered in his chest. Surely Jason could hear it. Jason's head snapped up. He turned sharply, eyes sweeping the brush. "Hello?" he called. "Is someone there?" Frank didn't move. He pressed his back to the tree, willing himself invisible, barely breathing. Jason stepped forward, shovel in hand. He walked a few paces toward the trees, paused, listening intently. Frank's throat felt tight. His hands clenched the bark of the tree behind him. After a few tense seconds, Jason muttered, "Just the wind," though he didn't sound convinced. He scanned the area once more, then returned to where he had buried the box. Instead of retracing his steps, he began to walk the perimeter of the overlook, checking the trees, scanning the bushes. His eyes passed over Frank's hiding place and lingered, just for a beat too long. Eventually, Jason appeared satisfied. He picked up the empty water container, secured the shovel to the garden trolley, and began the slow walk back to the cottage. Frank waited until the sounds of Jason's retreat faded completely before moving. Jason leaned the shovel against the weathered side of the cottage before slipping behind the wheel of his car and driving off. Frank remained hidden in the brush, counting under his breath. When he reached a full 100 and the quiet persisted, he finally emerged, his knees stiff and his muscles tense. Though his legs felt shaky, his resolve burned, steady. He had to know what was in that box. He had to understand why Jason had spoken Alicia's name aloud, like a whispered confession, over what looked disturbingly like a makeshift grave. He retraced his steps toward the site near the cliff, grabbing the shovel where Jason had carelessly left it by the cottage wall. As he returned to the mound of freshly disturbed earth, Frank's heartbeat thudded in his ears. He pushed the blade into the soil, digging with a mix of urgency and caution. The ground was still soft and moist, the effort requiring far less strength than he expected. After a few shovelfuls, the sweet, delicate fragrance of white hyacinths rose to meet him. Frank set the bouquet aside gently, his hands trembling. He continued digging, and before long the wooden box came into view. But just as his shovel struck the top edge of the box, a sudden voice shattered the stillness, and a bolt of cold shot down Frank's spine. "I knew someone was out here. I was right." Frank spun around, startled. Jason stood a few yards away, his face a volatile storm of anger and satisfaction. "You shouldn't have come back," Jason said, walking forward in slow, deliberate steps. "I saw your car parked up the road. I figured someone was watching, so I looped around through the trees, and here you are." His eyes dropped to the disturbed soil.
"What do you think you're doing?"
Frank's hands gripped the shovel tighter, ready to dig, ready to defend himself if necessary. "I heard you," he said, his voice unshaken though his insides churned. "I heard you say her name. Alicia. What have you buried here, Jason? What does any of this have to do with my daughter?" Jason's expression twisted with contempt. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snapped. "You shouldn't be here. You have no idea. None." Frank turned back toward the half-excavated hole, his back to Jason, defiance fueling every move. "Then I'll find out the truth myself," he said, stabbing the shovel back into the dirt. "Stop," Jason shouted. Frank turned to see a gun pointed at him. "Drop the shovel," Jason commanded, voice cracking. Frank raised his hand slowly, the shovel still clutched in one. His eyes stayed locked on Jason's, filled not with fear, but grief. "I'm calling the police," he said steadily, pulling out his phone with his free hand. "You can shoot me if you want. At least I'll be with my daughter again. But I'm one press away from the cops knowing exactly where I am." Jason's face twisted in panic. In a swift movement, he lunged at Frank, knocking the phone from his hand. It clattered to the ground, sliding dangerously close to the cliff's edge. "No!" Frank shouted. He dove forward, kicking the gun from Jason's hand in a desperate lunge. It flew from Jason's grasp and in a blink vanished over the edge of the cliff. Frank scrambled after his phone, fingers grasping just in time before it tumbled after the weapon. He hit the SOS button, hearing the familiar chime as it activated emergency mode, pinging his exact location. "Jason, stop this," Frank pleaded, stumbling back, the phone still clutched in one hand. "The police are coming. It's over. Just tell me the truth. If Alicia's dead, we can't undo that. But hiding it won't bring her back." Jason's eyes blazed, his breath coming in ragged bursts. "You don't get it," he shouted. "I still have everything to lose. My business, my reputation. This could ruin my life." Frank's voice broke. "Did you kill my daughter?" Jason flinched. "Did you?" Frank stepped forward now, his grief raw. "If you ever loved her, why would you do that? She was everything to us. My only child." Jason's features twisted with something between anguish and fury. "I never even knew what I felt," he yelled. "She should have stayed away. She kept coming back over and over, always thinking she could fix me. You don't know what it was like. If you'd really loved her, you would have protected her better." "What are you saying?" Frank whispered, horrified. "You didn't know her the way I did," Jason snapped. His voice had taken on a manic edge. He gripped the shovel tightly, his knuckles white. "She looked at me like I was worth saving. She made me feel like someone." "Then why didn't you say something when she went missing?" Frank cried. "Why bury this like it's a secret, like it's a grave?" "She betrayed me," Jason roared. In the end, she turned away. She didn't keep her promise. Before Frank could respond, Jason lunged again, this time slamming into him with the shovel and tackling him to the ground. Frank gasped as the younger man's hands closed around his throat, squeezing with terrifying force. He struggled, clawing at Jason's grip, his lungs screaming for air. The world narrowed to Jason's wild eyes and the blur of sky overhead. In them sirens. The distant wail grew louder by the second, cutting through the roar of blood in Frank's ears. Jason faltered, his grip loosening slightly. He turned his head toward the sound, and that hesitation was enough. Police vehicles raced up the drive, tires skidding, doors slamming. "Let him go," an officer shouted, weapon drawn. "Step back with your hands where we can see them." Jason dropped the shovel, backing away slowly, eyes wide with fear. 2 officers closed in instantly, securing him in handcuffs as another read him his rights. Frank collapsed to the ground, coughing and gasping for air. A female officer rushed to his side. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked, helping him to his feet. Frank nodded, wincing. "Yes, thank you." He turned, pointing toward the mound of disturbed soil. "There," he said hoarsely. "He buried something there. He spoke my daughter's name. Alicia Sanders. She vanished 22 years ago." The officer's expression turned grave. "Sanders? I remember that case. Hold on, I'm getting Detective Ramirez." As officers moved to secure the area, another man approached and handed Frank his phone. "Mr. Sanders, I'm Detective Ramirez. Can you tell me what happened?" Frank steadied himself. "It started with Alicia's yearbook," he said. "I found a note, visited an old friend of hers. Then I spoke to Jason. Something felt off. Then I saw him buying a shovel and white hyacinths. Alicia's favorite. I know I shouldn't have followed him." "But you did," Ramirez said, listening intently. "I had to," Frank whispered. "Something in my gut told me the truth was close." Detective Ramirez nodded slowly, his tone gentle but firm. "You said he buried something here?" Frank pointed to the freshly packed earth near the cliff's edge. "Yes." He dug a hole and placed a wooden box inside. He laid flowers over it. White hyacinths, Alicia's favorite. Before that, the wind blew some papers out of the box. He gathered them up quickly, then said something about Alicia, about her being able to hold those memories now. The detective gave a short nod and motioned to the forensic team that had arrived minutes earlier. "Let's see what we're dealing with." The forensic technicians, dressed in gloves and sterile suits, approached the disturbed site with precision. Frank stood nearby, arms crossed tightly, watching as they carefully worked to uncover the box. His throat was dry, and every second of waiting felt like an hour. The first thing they found was the bouquet. The hyacinths, remarkably fresh and unbruised despite being buried, were gently lifted out and placed in a sterile container. The lead technician then brushed away more soil, revealing the edge of a wooden box. They paused momentarily, documenting the scene with photographs from every angle. Then, with utmost care, the technician opened the box and slowly removed the contents one by one. Detective Ramirez leaned in as the interior of the box was exposed. Inside was a neatly stacked collection of documents, handwritten notes, faded photographs, and printed text messages. All of them appeared slightly yellowed with age, stored long enough to be marked by time. Nestled among the papers was a small wool doll, handmade, the type of thing a child might create during an arts and crafts class. Frank took a step closer, his voice raw. "He just buried this today. He said Alicia could have it now. That means all of this. He's been holding on to it for years, keeping it hidden in his home." Detective Ramirez nodded grimly. He pulled on a fresh pair of gloves and began sifting through the contents carefully. The first set of papers appeared to be printouts, text messages exchanged between Alicia and Jason. The dates were from their high school years. As Ramirez read through them, his expression darkened. "Mr. Sanders," the detective said gently, "these messages indicate that Alicia and Jason had a private relationship, secret and clearly complex. It wasn't something you or your wife would have known about at the time." Frank's jaw tightened. He moved beside the detective, his eyes scanning the pages. The messages painted a story he had never imagined. Alicia and Jason had met up several times. One outing mentioned a group event where Jason specifically asked Alicia not to bring Amy. One message recounted how Jason had kissed Alicia unexpectedly. Her initial texts showed confusion and hurt, But as the days passed, her tone shifted. She seemed torn, both wary and fascinated. She expressed doubts about him, but also expressed hope. Hope that he could change, that he just needed someone to care. She wanted to believe in him, Frank said aloud, barely a whisper. She thought he could be better. Dating in years, Detective Rubez flipped through more messages, revealing a prolonged, emotionally charged exchange. For nearly a year, Alicia had written messages filled with concern, affection, and reassurances. But Jason's responses were sporadic, often manipulative, cold, or dismissive. He never made promises, never offered emotional clarity. Eventually, Alicia began to pull away. In the later messages, her frustration was evident. She expressed pain, accused him of playing with her heart. She told him she was done, that she had found someone else, Brandon Knox, and wanted to move on. That's when Jason's tone turned venomous. Among the photos in the box were images that made Frank turn his face away in horror. Explicit photographs of Alicia, bound or restrained, her expression blank in some, fearful in others. The setting was unmistakable. The rustic wooden beams and furniture matched the interior of the very cottage Jason had come from earlier that day. Detective Ramirez immediately covered the photos, but before storing them, he turned each one over. Scrawled on the back of one image, in Jason's distinctive handwriting, was the same sentence, repeated over and over, filling the entire page. "You must still love me. You must still love me." Another read, "Had a great time at the cliffs with you. Yours, Jay." But it was the final photo that broke Frank's heart. Alicia's face in the image was contorted with fear, her eyes wide, lips parted as if mid-plea. The note on the back rambled in an unhinged scrawl, Jason describing how everything was falling apart, that people were starting to ask questions, that she, meaning Alicia, refused to talk things out. Then the final lines, "I'm sorry, but I had to. They would have found her, and they'd come for me. She'll always be with me, even if no one ever knows about us." "We'll need to get a formal confession," Ramirez said in a low voice to an officer nearby. "The notes don't say how he did it, but he all but admits to killing her." As the team continued to examine the box and evidence, another officer approached briskly. "Detective," she said, her tone urgent. "We found something else, about 15 feet from here in a shaded patch near the tree line. The soil there is different. We started a preliminary dig." Ramirez followed her silently. Frank trailed behind, his chest tightening with every step. When they reached the site, he saw the small pit that had been opened, and within it, fragments of human bone. Frank collapsed to his knees. He didn't weep. There were no tears left, just a crushing weight, a final, devastating answer to the question that had haunted him and Elaine for more than 2 decades. The forensic team expanded their search, carefully unearthing more of Alicia's remains as the sun drifted lower in the sky. Each bone, each piece of evidence confirmed what Frank's heart already knew. Ramirez walked over to Frank. "Mr. Sanders," he said softly, "would you like us to call your wife?" Frank nodded numbly. "Yes, please. And also Amy Davidson. She was Alicia's best friend. She deserves to know." The detective made the calls. As they waited, he offered to take Frank back to the station, but Frank shook his head. "No," he said. "I need to stay. Elaine should see this. Amy too. We waited 22 years for this moment. I can't walk away now." Elaine arrived nearly an hour later. The moment she stepped out of the car and saw Frank waiting near the crime scene tape, she knew. Her face turned pale, and she ran to him. They embraced, holding each other like survivors of a wreck that had taken years to fully unfold. Detective Ramirez explained gently, walking them through the findings. Amy arrived soon after, Her eyes were red, tears streaming freely as she approached the couple who had once treated her like their own daughter. She stood beside them, arms wrapped around Elaine, and together they watched the forensic team catalog what remained of Alicia. Elaine turned to the detective. Her voice was quivering but resolute. "We want her moved, not left here. She deserves peace. A proper resting place, not." "This," Ramirez nodded respectfully. "As soon as the forensic work is complete, we'll make arrangements. She'll be returned to you." Her voice shook as Amy stepped closer to the skeletal remains now partially unearthed, her cheeks glistening with tears. She knelt, hands trembling, and whispered, "Why didn't you tell me, Alicia? We were best friends. I could have helped you. We used to laugh about girls falling for guys like Jason. We never thought we'd be the ones." Her voice broke, lost in the rustle of wind through the cliffside trees. As the sun dipped low over the Pacific, long shadows fell across the clearing near Whitlow Cliff. Frank stood beside Elaine, their fingers interlocked, gazing at what had finally come to light after so many painful years. Amy stood beside them. Together the three kept vigil over Alicia's remains, the daughter, the friend, the girl who had vanished without a trace 22 years earlier. "She's coming home," Frank said softly, his voice barely more than a breath. His grip on Elaine's hand tightened. "She's finally coming home." 1 week later, Mornington's coast witnessed a rare calm. The sky was clear and the sea shimmered under bright sunlight. A solemn flotilla of small boats gathered in the bay just below Whitlow Cliff, a place once associated with tragedy, now transformed into a site of remembrance and peace. In the lead boat stood Frank and Elaine, their expressions a mixture of grief and quiet strength. Amy was with them, eyes puffy from sleepless nights but resolute. Also present were Detective Ramirez and retired Detective Ron Keller, both of whom had become integral to the Sanders family in recent weeks. Behind them, more boats filled with townspeople, Alicia's former classmates, teachers, neighbors, and school administrators. The arrest of Jason Murray and discovery of Alicia's fate had rippled through the town, reopening old wounds and stirring long-buried sorrow. Frank stood at the bow, a small urn clutched in his hands. After long and heartfelt discussions, he and Elaine had chosen not to bury Alicia in a cemetery. Alicia had loved the sea. It was where she had once dreamed of building her life, studying marine biology and dedicating herself to the ocean she adored. They chose to return her to it. The minister's voice rose above the sound of gently lapping waves. "Today we gather to say farewell to Alicia Sanders. For more than 2 decades, those who loved her have carried the burden of absence, the ache of not knowing. Today we lay down that burden. Today, Alicia returns to the sea, not as a victim, but as a free spirit, unbound." Elaine stepped forward, placing her hand gently on Frank's arm. Her voice, steady despite the tremor of sorrow, reached every vessel. Alicia loved the ocean. She had planned to dedicate her life to it. She told me once that the waves made her feel eternal. It's only right that her spirit rests here. Frank opened the urn. He and Elaine, side by side, scattered Alicia's ashes into the sea. A breeze caught them, lifting them in a graceful arc before they settled gently on the water's surface. From every boat, friends and mourners tossed white hyacinths into the waves. The petals formed a gentle bloom upon the ocean, a tribute of fragrance and color. Amy stepped forward, clutching the worn, beloved copy of The Secret Garden. With reverence, she placed the book onto the water's surface. "Goodbye, my friend," she said, voice cracking with emotion. "I'm sorry I never returned your book." As the boats slowly turned back toward shore, Detective Ramirez moved quietly to the Sanders side. Her voice was low. "He confessed," she said. "We have his full statement." Jason Murray had abducted Alicia shortly after graduation. According to his confession, he had never stopped obsessing over her since their quiet, short-lived relationship in high school. He convinced himself that he and Alicia were meant to be together. He lured her to the vacation cottage with the promise of privacy, of final clarity. He asked her to leave Brandon Knox, her then-boyfriend, and tell her family she had gone away on a solo trip to celebrate her future. Jason promised everything, a life together, a clean slate. But Alicia refused. She told him that she had outgrown the dream of saving him, that she had finally accepted who he was, broken, manipulative, dangerous. When she tried to escape, a struggle ensued near the cliff. In his rage, Jason overpowered her and beat her until she stopped moving. Panicked, he buried her body, hid her possessions, and tried to move on with his life. Amy, overhearing the confession, broke down again. She asked me questions about him years ago. She wondered if he could change. I didn't know why she cared so much. I thought we both knew he was trouble. If I'd known, maybe I could have protected her. Maybe she wouldn't have gone to him. Elaine turned and took Amy's hand. Her voice was kind but firm. Amy, none of this is your fault. Alicia had a gift. She believed in people, even when they didn't deserve it. Jason manipulated her, took advantage of that hope. You were her friend. You loved her. That's what matters. Ron Keller stood nearby, silent, his face heavy with guilt. We never saw it. He didn't have a record. He flew under the radar. Alicia never mentioned him. Our focus stayed on Brandon because he was her public boyfriend. Jason, he just kept living his life. We never looked in his direction again. As the flotilla reached the harbor, Frank turned for one last look at the sea. The white hyacinths still floated there, a drifting garden in the sun. The pain of loss hadn't left, but it had shifted, less sharp, more bearable. That evening, Frank and Elaine sat together on their back porch, a framed photo of Alicia between them. It wasn't her yearbook portrait, but a candid shot. Alicia, laughing, wind in her hair, wild with life and joy. Elaine reached for Frank's hand, her voice soft in the glow of sunset. I think we can start to move forward now, not by forgetting her, but by remembering who she really was, not just the girl who disappeared, the girl who lived, who dreamed, who loved. Frank's fingers closed around hers. She was so much like you, he said. That deep hopefulness, the belief that everyone has good in them. She tried to save him, and in the end, she saved all of us by helping us finally find the truth. And she had your stubborn streak too, Elaine said softly, her lips curling into a bittersweet smile. Once Alicia made up her mind that someone was worth saving, there was no convincing her otherwise, no reasoning, no warnings. It was just who she was. They sat together in a long, quiet pause. The silence between them no longer felt heavy or oppressive. It wasn't the barrier it had once been in the years that followed Alicia's disappearance. Now it was a kind of shared understanding. The space between them filled with memories and mutual sorrow, woven not from pain alone, but from endurance. I keep thinking about how young she was, Frank murmured at last, his voice barely rising above the soft hum of crickets outside. How innocent. She genuinely believed that love had the power to change people. Even someone like Jason. Elaine turned to look at him, her gaze steady but warm. That's not such a terrible thing to believe, she said. The world could use more people who see goodness where others only see failure. Alicia's mistake wasn't believing people could change. It was thinking she could do it all by herself. Frank gave a slow nod, the weight of the past easing ever so slightly from his shoulders. I just wish she had told us about Jason. Maybe we could have helped her see who he really was before it was too late. We'll never know, Elaine replied gently, But I truly believe wherever she is now, she knows we loved her. She knows we never stopped searching. Above them, the sky deepened to a velvet dusk, stars twinkling into view over Mornington's coastline. Frank tilted his head back, thinking about how everything had begun just 1 week ago when he opened that forgotten yearbook. How a single line about a borrowed book had opened the door to answers they thought they'd never find. The mystery of what had happened to Alicia was finally resolved, but the greater journey, the lifelong work of living with loss and finding moments of peace, was only beginning. Still, for the first time in more than 2 decades, Frank felt something close to peace. Alicia was home now, not in body, but in memory, in the sea she loved, and in the hearts that would never let her go.